This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 41 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast on culture shock abroad. Now, I think culture shock can be a bit traumatic, especially when it's one of the first times you've travelled somewhere. If I think about the first time I went to Japan, and bearing in mind I was arriving there to live for at least a year, so it was a little bit more confronting than just going on a holiday. And I arrived in the middle of hot summer from a Perth winter, couldn't find anything to eat because I didn't understand any of the characters on the packaging in the tiny semi-supermarket near the apartment I'd been taken to. I couldn't really understand how to work half of the appliances in my apartment. There were so many unknowns and language barriers and so much, and I really had that experience of culture shock, a full-on shock. And I remember lying on my futon, which was another new thing, which I grew to love, I must say, but thinking, oh my goodness, what have I done? Now, that only lasted a day or two in that extreme form, but throughout my years in Japan, there was always new things that shocked me, and I got used to them shocking me, and I learnt to love pretty much all of it. But it can be traumatic the first time, and I can understand how some people find culture shock a reason not to travel somewhere with a different culture. It can feel a bit too confronting. The good thing is, though, I think that when you travel enough, culture shock becomes something that you actually seek out. I remember when I eventually moved to Germany after spending time living in Japan and Slovakia and traveling around Asia and Europe. And I got to Germany and I was sort of sad because there wasn't much culture shock, especially initially. It seemed so same and so much like being back home in Australia. And that was one of those places that took longer to tease out the cultural differences, and it was fascinating in its own way. But I wanted more culture shock and I didn't get it. So it's funny. Culture shock can be a good or a bad thing, but it's always something that's interesting and always something that's different to home. And that's what the three guests today are going to be talking about. So my first guest is Matt Treglia from the Words with Winos podcast, and he had some interesting things to say about his first experiences with culture shock when he first travelled in Asia.
I didn't really know what to expect with customs. For example, before I started traveling, I would watch like so many travel shows on the Travel Channel and so many YouTube videos, and I kind of thought I had a good idea of customs in other countries, and I was totally wrong. I mean, you learn a certain amount about a country from watching TV, but you really don't know anything until you physically go. So I think one of the biggest things for me was just the first time I ever traveled on my own, and it was to Thailand, and I was with my girlfriend Marilyn, and it kind of just everything about their customs and their way of life kind of just blew me away. I didn't know, I just didn't know what to do. I wasn't prepared. I thought I was, and I wasn't. I think one of the first things I noticed was we got there like in the evening, and it was just the traffic and just the motorbikes and the cars, and it was just like something as simple as crossing the street was just such a difficult thing to do. And I wasn't used to that. I'm used to just waiting at the light, and then when it says walk, I walk. And it was just such a difficult thing just to cross the street. And I just wanted to go get something to eat. And it was like a horrifying experience where I had to worry about dying. And something like that kind of scared me. Yeah. And we didn't even like cross the street on our first try. We were too nervous. We went back to our hotel and we're just like, oh my God, like this is terrifying.
I totally relate.
Yeah, that was definitely like the first custom and experience that I had that really like sticks out to me. And also just like something as like maybe like the next day I noticed people don't wait online. People kind of just will cut each other, and whoever's like maybe the most aggressive will just like go first to go purchase something. And yeah, those were like the first two things that really stood out to me when I first got to Thailand, was just like, wow, this is different. This is not America. This is in Canada. This is a different world.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to Southeast Asia, I went to Vietnam, and I had exactly that experience of trying to cross the road. And I remember the first day or two, I thought, actually, this is impossible and I am definitely going to die. And but then like 2 weeks later, I could just sort of throw myself out there and everyone went around and I'd kind of got the hang of it. But I still remember very vividly that intense fear and thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to spend a few weeks here? This is impossible.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I went to Vietnam as well, and I was actually more prepared for that because of Thailand. Like after a few weeks and a few months of living there, it was no problem crossing the street. And then when I got to Vietnam, it was definitely a little more intense because there's like really no cars. It's just motorbikes everywhere. So I had to like dodge it, but I was a little more prepared and I had a little more confidence.
Yes. Well, it's funny. I had the reverse experience because last year I went to Thailand for the first time and I was expecting it to be just like Vietnam. And I actually wrote a blog post about, I think it was, X things that had surprised me in Thailand. And one of them was how easy it was to cross the road and how orderly everything seemed, because I had this expectation that it would be more like Vietnam and it wasn't. So, and at the train stations, people were lining up like beautifully, like better than they line up here in Australia. And I was like, hang on, what country am I in? I was totally confused. So I had the reverse problem.
Well, yeah, that is exactly the reverse problem, but I'm happy that it was so much easier for you.
Yes. Well, when your expectations, when reality is better than your expectations or easier than your expectations, then I guess, it's a pleasant surprise. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other really unusual customs that you came across on your travels that really shocked you at first?
Actually, yeah. One thing I could think of off the top of my head that's actually affecting me now that I'm home in America. Tipping. In Asia, there's no tipping for anything. And when we first got there, we would, like at a restaurant, for example, we would get our food and then we would try to tip them, and they would kind of be a little bit offended by that. They're like, no. And we were so confused as to why they wouldn't take our tip. And then I think someone we met was just like, yeah, they don't take tips here. Like, what? And it was kind of like, yeah, it was kind of mind blowing, because our whole lives in America we tip for everything, and all of a sudden, like in Asia, for Thailand, for example, there was just no tipping, and we're like, okay, that's interesting. And now that we're back in America, it's like, oh my God, we have to tip for everything. This sucks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What I always found really hard in America, I mean, you grew up there, so you have this idea, but when I am in America, it's such a rabbit warren of like, okay, should I tip this person? And if so, how much? And how do I decide? And like, it's really, really stressful. And here in Australia, we don't do any tipping. Like at a restaurant, you might round up the bill, but that's as far as we go in terms of tipping. And that suits me just fine, because I find it like an extraordinarily stressful thing to try and figure out when and how much to tip.
Absolutely. I'm from here, from America, and I still don't know how much to tip. I asked Marilyn to do that for me. She knows exactly, because she was a waitress, so she knows what they get, and then I don't know, I guess she knows what other people get as well. But yeah, I live here, and I still am very confused and frustrated by it.
Oh, well, that's
so I totally understand.
Somewhat reassuring to hear that. I love these two examples of culture shock and cultural differences from Matt. And I think that traffic and tipping are two of those kind of cultural shock issues that are really common experiences for many travellers. Certainly anyone who's been to one of those cities in Southeast Asia where 90% of the transport is motorbikes can relate to that feeling of standing on the side of the road and seeing, 10, 12, 20 lanes is not the right word for it, but streams of motorbikes careering past them and thinking there's no way you can ever get through. and it becomes a game of Frogger, I think, if you remember that older arcade game of Frogger, trying to get forward and back and get through those bikes without getting hit. And it is certainly a matter of courage and having some blind belief that the motorcyclists will go around you. And it seems to work pretty well once you get used to it. But that first day when you need to do that and you haven't done that before, that is just that epitome of culture shock. And if you've been there and done that, you will know exactly what I'm saying. You'll still remember that moment, I think. Now, my next guest today is Diana Edelman of D Travels Round, and she spent some years living in Thailand as well. So we've got some more culture shock and cultural differences to hear about the Thai people from Diana.
Well, the trickiest I've had is Thailand because that is basically like the opposite of an American.
Yes, I bet.
It's you don't lose face, you don't show emotion, and I am the complete opposite. Like, oh my God, I wear my heart on my sleeve. If I see like an animal suffering, I cry. If I watch a commercial that like is sappy, I cry. Like, I am a crier. And so
Me too.
It is very difficult going to a country where you are not supposed to really show emotion. So that was a huge challenge for me. And also just in general, the Thai culture is very conservative. And so coming from America, where you wear what you want, you act how you want, and, you have consequences, but whatever. And coming to Thailand, you really have to rein it in, and you really have to learn how to be more delicate, more graceful, more polite in the sense of, you have to really look at what you wear. You have to look at your mannerisms. Like if you point at something with your toes, it's rude. If you walk into a place with your shoes on, it's rude. If you touch someone's head, like there's a lot of different cultural things that you have to kind of learn. And I made the mistakes all the time when I first moved there, but everything, whether it's, just in conversation with a Thai friend and be like, you don't know what you're talking about. Oh my God. Well, I just made them lose face. And I didn't even think about it because in America, it's like, oh, whatever. Like, you're wrong. Whatever.
Yeah,
and
totally normal.
In Thailand, you can't. And so, it's that, or I used my feet so much when I first moved there, or like forgot to take my shoes off, or like, like we're not the classiest of people sometimes. And I think maybe one day I had something stuck in my tooth and I wasn't paying attention. And like, I just like put my finger in my mouth. Oh my God.
Oh, no.
It's very in Thailand, like you'll see people and even with a toothpick, they will take a toothpick and cover their mouth so you can't see what they're doing.
Right.
And so it's little teeny things that you slowly learn, but you make those mistakes as you go and you kind of go from there. But or touching a monk, I never did that. But there's a lot of different things that you have to be aware of in culture and like as a responsible tourist, as a tourist or a traveler in general. I think that a lot of people don't take the time to acknowledge the customs or the cultures of the places they're visiting, and instead they just go and expect that where they're visiting is like where they're from, and it's not the case. And it can put you in an awkward situation. It can put the people in the culture in an awkward situation, and it makes bad situations basically.
Absolutely.
So I really try before I go somewhere to kind of learn about things and make sure I'm not going to be a complete jerk and I'm not going to insult somebody, because it's so easy. There's those things you see on Pinterest, like the gestures around the world, hand gestures around the world. And, like the A-OK in our country is something like completely inappropriate in another.
Exactly.
So you have to learn, even the difference between like some of our slang between like me and you,
that's right.
I don't even know what I could say on this podcast where it's going to be like, am I going to insult somebody if I say a word, in your slang that is completely the opposite of ours?
Absolutely. My mum always tells this funny story. She married an American, maybe 20 years ago. He's since passed away, but so had an American stepfather for a while, and they met online and, talked over the internet and stuff. And one day she said to him something which is like common in Australia. He must have said something a bit kind of goofy, and she said to him, I think it was in an email, she said, "Oh, you're such a dag." And that's a dag is a thing that we would, use in Australia. It's kind of an endearing, you're just a goofy, what a silly thing to say kind of thing. But he didn't know that word, and he went away and looked it up, and it's actually kind of a disgusting part of a sheep. But And he came back really confused.
Oh,
And,
because I was just thinking I wanted to work that into my vocabulary now to sound more international. So, but good to know.
just be careful who you use it with.
Okay.
But actually, safer is daggy, I suppose. Then
Daggy. Well,
yeah.
you Aussies love to add the E's at the end of words. I love it.
I know we do, don't we?
Sunnies, mozzies, footy. I was just talking to someone today about how I know so much Australian slang, and then I realized I don't. I thought I did.
But if you're right, if you just add an E sound on the end, then you're probably pretty right most of the time.
Well, you guys just make words sound cute is what you do. Like, you could take the ugliest word and you add like a little E to it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, those mozzies. And you're like, I hate mosquitoes, but when you say, oh, those mozzies, you're like, oh, they're such cute little bugs that suck your blood.
I love it, because I've always thought that we just do it that way because we're really lazy, but it's way better to hear that it sounds cute. So I'm going to go with that from now on. Diana's descriptions of the cultural differences that she experienced when she moved to Thailand are a lot of parallels between them and my experiences when I moved to Japan. Certainly, it's not like the Japanese people or the Thai people would ever come out and say, hey, you're doing that wrong, you're offending us. So it's quite a subtle thing to figure out how to fit into the culture without offending people. But an interesting one. It's just can be a bit of hard work at the beginning, but well worth the effort. Most of all, from what Diana said, I love hearing what other people think about us, we Aussies. And there we go, I've done it again. Australians, we don't have to put an E sound on everything, or maybe we do. So I love the idea that mosquitoes sound cute when you call them mozzies. I still don't like them, actually, even when you call them mozzies. But I like that Diana thinks it sounds better. So there you go, that's a nice Aussie thing. Now, my final guest today is Emma Mann, and we're leaving Asia for the Middle East now, and some of the experiences she had as a young woman in the Middle East.
It's a thing that happens in the world, that everywhere you go in the world, things are just different, and some of those things are fabulous, and those are the things that I love about travel, is finding out what is different, and especially for what is different for local women. And probably the most confronted I've ever been was when we were backpacking through the Middle East. And
oh, yeah, I bet.
We'd been through Egypt and all of the confrontation that is Cairo. Just too much.
Yes.
And then we'd been, so we've done all the touristy things around Dahab, and we'd done diving certificates, and we'd been diving and all that sort of thing, and that was fabulous. And then we were working our way up. We'd been through Jordan, and we were in Syria. And I kind of noticed on my way, and this trip, it was a long time ago now, obviously, because we were in Syria.
True, yeah. Yes, good point.
I think it was 2000 and, oh, God, I was still living in the UK, so it must have been 2003, 4, something like that.
Yeah.
And I had noticed, this was in the days before I was ready to call myself a feminist loudly, because as a woman, when you call yourself a feminist, well, then boys don't like you.
Yes, sad but sometimes true.
When you're 20, that's terrifying.
Fair enough. Yes.
When you're 30, you don't care anymore.
No. And trust me, when you're 40, you care even less.
So I had kind of noticed that men were very happy to speak to me. Women were not at all happy to speak to me, which I found strange because I'm a woman, and so therefore I'm not a threat. It's not like you're not allowed to speak to me. I'm not a man. So what is stopping you? And I put it down to shyness or fear, maybe, of sort of this unknown, loud, out there woman with blonde hair and very fair skin who looks completely alien to what other excuses was I making up for myself? I think I just put it down to that's just how women are in this part of the world. They are not
outgoing and speaking to strangers.
Exactly. And the further in we went and the more we explored, so we went through Egypt, Jordan, Syria and Israel, and each country is completely different to the last. But I think I found it most confronting in Syria, where women were in my experience at least, very sheltered and very held back from any kind of idea that might break them from tradition. And it shocked me. I was very young. I'd not really experienced a country that was terribly different to Australia yet. Like, all of my travel previous to that had been the UK and Europe, and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
But,
so, yes, but
you know,
different.
very different. And still, all of those countries I had been to previously still had all of the same Western ideals that we have at home in Australia.
Yes.
Maybe with different accents and different languages, but still
not so different. Yeah.
that I was thrown out of my comfort zone. And then we went to the Middle East, and it was very confronting. And I'm glad that we went, and Syria was a beautiful country and the people were lovely, the ones that I got to speak to. And if they were stable now, I still wouldn't go back.
Really?
Really.
Wow.
Really.
Wow.
Because it was so closed. I wasn't allowed to have an opinion as a woman. We would be in a shop trying to buy something and they would defer to my partner. And I was not used to being ignored or
not allowed to have your own ideas.
Have an opinion. And that was the first time I had really experienced anything like that.
I completely agree with Emma, because as a woman too, it's hard for me to accept cultures that don't treat women even remotely equally. I'm not going to pretend we're treated equally even here in Australia, but it's a lot more equal than in a lot of other countries. One of the saddest sort of examples to me is the way I saw women treated in Japan, because I love Japan and so much about Japan so much, but it is still a very patriarchal society. And I would have, as an example, I would have these housewives, because being a housewife is a common occupation in Japan. It's still quite common that women stop working after they marry. And I would have these housewives come to my English language lessons in the middle of the day, and it wasn't unusual, wasn't completely common, but thankfully, but not unusual to find that some of those wives were taking English lessons secretly without having told their husbands, and they would pay for these lessons by squirreling away sort of a small portion of the household money every month until they could save up enough to pay for their English lessons. And what sort of scared me about that is they even have a word in the Japanese language, hesokuri, which means that money that these housewives have kind of, nearly stolen. Not really. They're quite entitled to it, I think. But they've gathered this money so that they can use it for things that they won't tell their husbands about. And while I can see why you might not want to tell your husband if you're going out to, expensive champagne lunches every day, but surely learning English is not something that you ordinarily need to hide from the person you're supposed to love the most. So that always, kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And a few experiences like that in Japan made me concerned. And glad that I wasn't born as a woman in Japan, to be perfectly honest, as much as I love so much about that country. Anyway, that's just another of the many cultural differences that you experience when you travel. And if you are like me and you now embrace culture shock, then go anywhere. If you're perhaps a newer traveller and more concerned about culture shock, then do plenty of research before you go and make sure you've found ways that you can deal with it. In fact, let me add to that, do research whichever of those people you are, because it's always good to know ahead of time how to not offend people and how to fit in, and just to be a little bit aware of what kind of culture shocks you might face. So thank you very much for listening to episode 41 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. If you want to chat some more about culture shock that you've experienced through your travels, then the best way is to come along to our Facebook group. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook and ask to join the group. Or you can also follow the link in the show notes and that will get you there as well. I also always love to chat on Twitter, so you can tweet me at Amanda Kendall and use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod so that I can find what you're saying as well. As always, big thank you to my guests and their fascinating stories. First up, I had Matt Treglia, first-time guest on the Thoughtful Travel podcast today. He's from the Words with Winos podcast. He and his girlfriend Marilyn consume an appropriate or matching bottle of wine, or sometimes just a bottle of wine from somewhere interesting in the world, while they chat, travel, and record their podcast, which I think is a great idea. And in their honour today, I'm having some Western Australian Chardonnay while I record. So there you go. It's late in the evening. So you can find Matt at wordswithwinos.com, and there's also a link in the show notes to the Words with Winos podcast. Further to my chat with Matt there, I'm also including a link to my post on Not a Ballerina about the things I didn't expect in Bangkok, which I mentioned. After Matt, I chatted with Diana Edelman from D Travels Round, so she's at dtravelsround.com, and you can also find her at vegansbaby.com, which is a great site for vegans visiting Vegas with the coolest clever name, I think. And finally, I spoke with Emma Mann, and you can find her at thevagabondfeminist.wordpress.com or at flyingfoodieadventures.com, and both those links are in the show notes. And just following up on what I mentioned about the hesokuri, the Japanese women housewives sort of secret money, I've left a link in the show notes to an interesting article that I found about that as well. Thank you so much, and do drop by the Facebook group, please, because I would love to hear about the culture shock that you have experienced on your travels. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.